advise.
I am here today to talk about one of the weirdest things that happened during my time at university. Let me start by saying I was an IT major. The first thing that comes to mind might be all the cliches about the people studying IT. Yes, they are all true. Don't get me wrong, there are lots of normal people who study IT as well. I like to think of myself as fairly normal, for example, at least compared to certain other people. It just seems that in the IT field, the number of freaks and social outcasts was the highest. You had the guys who normally kept to themselves and shrunk whenever someone approached them. There was the typical social retard who started to sweat and shake when a girl would be passing by. And of course the cliche nerd in a button-down that talked about spending the weekend playing around with Linux kernels and compilers. Honestly, pretty much everyone would feel like the cool kid with these guys around. At the time of this story, I shared an apartment with a couple of other people in southern Germany. One of them was a guy I majored in IT with, Stefan. He was pretty much one of the typical cliche nerds I mentioned above. I have obviously no way to know, but he might have been autistic. He had no real interest and spent all of his time on the computer. He spent his time programming or toying with software, but never playing games. There was never anything interesting going on in his life. I can't recall ever seeing him with girls. Well, to be honest, I never saw him with anyone. For all I know, he might have been asexual. The two other people I lived with were pretty normal. One was a guy who majored in mechanics and who kept mostly to himself. He was nice enough, but not the social type. The other was a good friend of mine, Jake. He and I had originally planned to just get a place together, but rent was way too high, so we decided to room with some other people. That's how we got to live with Stefan. Things started out pretty good. During the first few weeks, we'd often hang out together, have some drinks, or watch movies. After some time, though, we all settled down into our own individual routines. As time went on, the overall mood in the place changed. Jake wasn't a big fan of Stefan to begin with, but he mostly tolerated him. Stefan, on the other hand, had mostly ignored Jake. There seemed to be some sort of truth between the two of them. At times, I honestly wasn't sure if Stefan was too much of a social retard to even realize that Jake disliked him. Soon enough, though, I found out this wasn't the case, as the two of them started to openly antagonize each other in more or less subtle ways. At first it was mostly hilarious pranks, a hidden alarm clock in the room of the other that would start to ring in the middle of the night, the occasional hidden item, and other similar stuff. It was all pretty childish, but it gave me a couple of good laughs. I just hoped that things wouldn't escalate any further. I couldn't afford to move to a different place. It was about 2 months into the whole pranking when I saw Stefan bringing a box filled with all kinds of weird stuff. When I approached him and asked him what all the stuff was, he kept quiet and quickly vanished into his room. One thing I had seen was a freaking voodoo puppet. I was laughing my ass off at this. The pure image of him sitting in his room, poking needles into that thing, hoping it would work, was absolutely hilarious. He must have read about it on Reddit or maybe even 4chan. I knew he was a weird guy, but that was too much even for him, or simply too dumb. I seriously wasn't sure. What made this whole thing even more ridiculous was that a couple of days later, Jake started to complain about back pains, headaches, and overall feeling of dizziness. I asked him if he was sick or if he ate something bad, but he shrugged it off and said it was most likely just a cold. Things didn't get better for him, though. He said he had almost constant back pains and woke up feeling dizzy and not rested at all, not to mention the headaches. I told him to go to a doctor and get himself checked out, but he had said he had to focus on his exams. Maybe it was the studying and the stress. He told me if things didn't get better after exams were over, he'd definitely go. Jake was the type who never went to see the doctors if he could avoid it. In all the years I knew him, he only went when he broke his foot during sports. By then I had completely forgotten about the voodoo puppet, but one day I got home and saw Stefan happily tinkering with it in the hallway. He put nails into the head and back of it and was shaking it violently. As soon as he saw me, he hit it and started an awkward conversation about networking protocols. We made a bit of small talk, but soon enough he retreated back to his room. I shook my head. There was no frickin' way. It must be a coincidence, I told myself. Still, I felt somewhat happy to never have gotten on Stefan's bad side. Things continued like that for a couple of days, and at one point, I told Jake about the voodoo puppet. Jake laughed when I told him and said Stefan was a frickin' retard. I noticed that he was nonetheless somewhat agitated about the whole thing. In the end, he just said he couldn't deal with the idiot's antics at the moment. 2 days later, though, the two of them got into an argument in the kitchen. Things might have gotten physical, if not for our other roommate, who must have heard the trouble and intervened. Jake had apparently found Stefan in the kitchen with a puppet, smiling brightly and popping needles in and out of the head and back. That was the moment when Jake had had enough. He went over and confronted Stefan, asking what the deal with this shit was. When Jake pushed him against the wall, Stefan started muttering to himself. It was then that the mechanics guy came into the kitchen to see what was going on. In this moment, it was pretty much over. Jake just sighed and said he was going to make himself some coffee, while Stefan simply walked off with his silly little puppet in hand. The whole ordeal continued over the course of the next week. Jake didn't get much better, and Stefan continued to be an annoyance with the voodoo puppet. He'd just come out of his room with the thing in hand, or toying with it while he was preparing his meals in the kitchen. It was ridiculous, and I soon was sure that he was just fucking with Jake. His whole plan must have been for Jake to notice it and freak out, or at least wonder about it. Just another childish prank to have Jake worry about during exam times, and Jake had fallen for it. One thing that most people might not know is that exam period in Germany is not just a week or two long. Depending on the university, it can be as long as your actual semester break. It was not uncommon for my last exam to be held a week before classes would start again. Now, my last semester had been hell, and I had almost failed some of my exams, so I decided to take things a little easier. I had focused mostly on presentations and project work, and only had to take a couple of short exams at the beginning of the exam period. After those were done, I only had my part-time job to worry about. The rest of my time was spent hanging out with friends, going out, and enjoying the late summertime. One day I got home late at night. I had had a few drinks, but I wasn't really drunk. I entered the apartment as quiet as possible. While my exams were over, the rest of my roommates were still busy studying and preparing for theirs. I tried my hardest not to wake or disturb any of them. I made my way towards my room and saw that the door to Jake's room was open. The light was out, but I saw a dark figure rummaging around inside of the room. I asked my friend if everything was all right, but I didn't get an answer. Knowing that he had been complaining about being sick, I went over to see if he was all right. I turned on the lights in the hallway, and for a moment I jumped back with a surprised cry. There was someone else in the room, and in the first moment I assumed it must be a burglar. A moment later, I recognized the figure. It was Stefan. He wore some sort of weird fetish mask, was completely naked, and I could see his erect cock between his legs. Behind him I saw Jake lying on the bed, his lower half exposed and naked as well. I just stood there trying to take the whole situation in. Our fourth roommate was next to me only moments later, woken by my cry, and now he saw the same grotesque view. Stefan freaked out, started to yell and scream at us, before he pushed past us and ran into his room, locking the door behind himself. It was only at this point that we noticed that Jake was out cold. We called the cops then and there. After Stefan didn't open the door to his room, I was happy to see that the officers simply kicked it in, handcuffed him, and took him away. When Jake woke up, he felt dizzy as usual, had a splitting headache and the usual back pains. He was taken to hospital right away. What they found out was that Jake had been drugged. Not only this night though, but for weeks. The cops checked the whole place. They found a number of different narcotics in Stefan's room and also in most of Jake's food. It was soon determined that this was the reason for his constant headaches and the dizziness. The reason for the back pains was unknown, but it must have come from whatever Stefan did to Jake when he was out cold at night. As far as the hospital found though, there was never any sort of penetration, and looking back, Jake had never complained about any pains related to it. I honestly can't say what kind of sick, perverted things Stefan had been up to. He got into some serious trouble though. Jake obviously pressed charges. I think Stefan was charged with a number of offenses, including sexual assault and drug possession. Jake stayed at the hospital for some time and later went into therapy to cope with the fact that some sick, fat fuck had drugged him and assaulted him when he was out cold. It was only after I had made my statement and got home that I finally realized why Stefan had gotten the damn voodoo puppet. It was all a charade to confuse the rest of us. Sure, no one would believe for a second that Jake's pain was caused by actual voodoo magic, but it still made us ponder about the stupid thing. We sure as hell never got the idea of drugs or medication or even sexual abuse.